I will introduce our next speaker. All right, so actually I mentioned her in my talk. This is Alba Rodriguez, and she's going to present on the vanas, which I showed as a shared framework between yoga schools. Alba Rodriguez is a PhD student in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of California, Riverside. She completed a master's degree in yoga studies at LMU in California, and her research focuses on South Asian philosophical and religious traditions with a main focus on Jain ethical and meditational practices. Everybody, please welcome Alba Rodriguez.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. First of all, I have to say I'm very happy to be here with all of you today and to see advisors, mentors, colleagues, and friends here. Thanks for the organizers to put all of us together. And yeah, I look forward to hearing your thoughts at the end and your questions, because I'm still working on this project. So let me share my screen and we get started. So most of my presentation comes from a chapter that I wrote for the book in Engage, Jainism, that Dr. Miller and Dr. Bohanek are editing, as you already mentioned before. It is in fact a summary of that chapter. But first of all, what do I mean by the four bhavanas? Well, Dr. Bohanek already introduced them to us, but I will briefly repeat the main ideas. So these four bhavanas refer to the cultivation of bhavana, of benevolence, maitri, sympathetic joy, pramoda, compassion, karunya, and equanimity, madhyasya. As I will show today, these four practices seem to have had a relevant place in Jain religiosity. We do not find the term four bhavanas per se in the Tarvarta Sutra or earlier Jain texts, as far as I know, but some later Jain authors do refer to them as the four bhavanas. And that is why I am using this as a title today. As part of Jain praxis, these four bhavanas or cultivations seem to have been used by Jains to lead a life of minimal harm. And as many of you might know, they have similar counterparts in other South Asian religions. For example, many Buddhist scholastic texts discuss an almost identical practice, often referred to as the Brahma Viharas. That's why I put this image here. And love for Maitri, the Buddhists often translate it as this love and kindness. That is the one you see in the image. Compassion, equanimity, and joy. And there are also references to these four practices in Brahmanical literature. However, scholarship about these practices in the Jain context is very limited. So my chapter explores how the bhavanas are explained in different Jain textual sources and how they developed in engagement with Buddhist and Brahmanical intellectual environments. The chapter includes different interpretations of these practices from some of the great philosophers of Jainism, such as Umasvati, Haribhadasuri, Hemachandra, and Yashovijaya. There are different ways in which Jains have used the word bhavana throughout history. And in my chapter at the beginning, I do talk a little bit about this. But today, for the sake of time, I will discuss directly some of these texts that include a particular set of four bhavanas. So I'll start with the Tarvarta Sutra. And although they are not called the four bhavanas per se, the four cultivations of benevolence, sympathetic joy, compassion, and equanimity are included in chapter 5, which discusses the 5 vows or Mahavratas. Umasvati writes, benevolence towards all living beings, sympathetic joy at the side of the virtues, compassion for the afflicted, and equanimity towards the unvirtuous are to be trained. The bhavanas are presented as practices for strengthening both the vows of the Jain mendicants and also the vows of Jain householders, and are complementary to other religious observances that are actually mentioned in the same chapter. The location of the four bhavanas in the Tarvarta Sutra suggests that these are not independent practices, but instead they are included in a broad Jain ethical and soteriological framework that gives priority to the vows with the main goal of minimizing harm or himsa. Then I'm going to move on history and some other later Jain texts. Jain texts written between the centuries indicated in this table. Let me show the table. This will be easier. As Dr. Chappell has explained in detail in his scholarship, and also Dr. Bohanec has shared some of the insights of some of these texts just before me. So some of these texts are marked by tremendous innovations in Jain philosophical thought. In fact, during all these centuries, I'm aware it's a very broad period of time. So Jain authors reconstructed Jain yoga through comparative studies with other yoga systems. And as also Dr. Bohanec has clarified just before me, most of these authors, they did not use the word yoga to refer to action that causes the influx of karma as understood in earlier Jain canonical sources. Instead, the authors that we find here, they often use the term yoga to refer in general to religious practices with the main goal of producing auspicious karma, punya, or eliminating negative karma, papa. So next, I will consider the bhavanas in three Jain yoga texts, the Yoga-bindu, the Yoga-śāstra, and the Dṛṣṭi-samuccaya. In my chapter, I also include the Yoga-dṛṣṭi-samuccaya, but today I only have 20 minutes, so I decided to leave this one out. And I have chosen this text as an example because they were all written by Shvetambara authors who appear to be building upon one another's work, but they are also simultaneously engaging with thought found in other non-Jain traditions of the times. Of course, there are other authors that also discuss the bhavanas, such as the Digambara Mendicant Shubha Chandra from 11th century. And furthermore, non-scholarly Jain writings on this topic they abound. There are so many, particularly regarding benevolence and compassion. Because I limit myself here to only a few Shvetambara yoga texts, I am very aware that much more research remains to be done to offer a full genealogy of the four bhavanas. That is why I really welcome your feedback and your questions for this chapter and for future work. So let's have a look to the first of these texts that I chosen. The Yoga-bindu was written in the 6th century by the Jain scholar Arihanta and discusses yoga practices found in different religious traditions, such as worship, ethical training, and meditation. Haribhadra presents a fivefold yoga consisting of these 5 parts that Dr. Cohen just briefly explained as well. So I'm going to move forward. And the 4 bhavanas appear at the beginning of the last section of the Yoga-bindu, which offers a recapitulation of different modalities of yoga explained in earlier parts of the text, such as mantra recitation or deity worship. And Haribhadra says, one should develop friendliness, maitri, toward those who possess goodness, sympathetic joy, pramoda, for those who have superior qualities, compassion, karunya, for those afflicted with pain, and equanimity, madhyastya, towards those who are without knowledge. The distinguished person of discernment is born. In his detailed analysis of other important texts by Haribhadra, Dr. Mundra shows that instead of seeking to minimize differences between traditions, Haribhadra is mostly concerned with finding reasons to assess those differences, articulating Jain identity in dialogue with other traditions. Here we see how Haribhadra embraces what we can now call the 4 pan-Indic bhavanas while standing firmly in his Jain view. And now that I'm mentioning Dr. Mundra, thank you so much to Dr. Mundra and Dr. Chappell, because I'm doing this work in collaboration and guidance with them. So moving on to the next text, I will go to the second one, to the Yoga-śāstra, that also Dr. Bohanec just talked about this text to us just now. So in this one, many of you might be familiar with it. As you all know, the Yoga-śāstra is a 12th century Sanskrit text written by Hemachandra, and it's often considered the most comprehensive text for lay Shvetambara Jains. It also includes different practices under the label of yoga. The 4 bhavanas are included too, but they are not called bhavanas per se. Hemachandra defines each of them briefly in this way. So he says, in order to reconnect the broken virtuous meditation, one should practice friendliness, maitri, appreciation, pramoda, compassion, and tolerance. So and then he says, these 4 are like elixirs of life for him. But as you might notice here, this translation is not mine. This is by Quanstrom. So he's using the words, it's slightly different. For pramoda, Quanstrom is using appreciation, and for madhyastya, I'm using equanimity. Quanstrom is using tolerance. I think this might be a little bit problematic. But anyway, I wanted to leave this translation because just to remind all of us that study Sanskrit of the complexities of the language. And then he goes on, Hemachandra, and he gives a brief definition of Maitri. He says, may no one commit evil, may no one suffer, may the entire world be liberated. Such a sentiment is called friendliness. And then he continues with pramoda. Appreciation pramoda is predilection for the virtues of those whose defects have been removed and who sees reality as it is. Then he continues with compassion. The will to remove the conditions of those who are in a miserable condition, tormented, excessively terrified, and begging to their life is called compassion. Karunya. And last one, equanimity, he says, that which remains unconditionally neutral towards cruel acts, towards those who blaspheme against the jinas and the teachers, and towards those who praise themselves, that is called madhyasya. When a man of great intellect meditates on the self by means of these 4 practices, even if the continuity of pure meditation is broken, it is reconnected. So as we can see in the Yoga-śāstra, these 4 bhavanas are presented as a kind of a way to reconnect or to reconnect with higher meditative states. These verses are included in a section of chapter 4 that discusses the importance of equanimity meditation, preceded by a section on the difficulties of attaining enlightenment, and followed by a section on yogic postures. And again, as some of you might be familiar with the context of Yoga-śāstra, but let me just remind briefly that Hemachandra wrote this text, as well as other texts, for the Shaiva king Kumarapala after his conversion to Jainism. Dundas has explained that the text's main goal was to show the king how to live as a Jain. Nonetheless, the Yoga-śāstra still contains influences from the Trika Shaiva and the Nath traditions. Court points out that the main goal of this attitude was to ensure the king's attention to the Jains in a court dominated by the Shaivas. Hemachandra's decision to include the 4 bhavanas alongside other Jain teachings in his long treatise indicates his continuous engagement in Jain practices with the tantric and Shaiva religious sensibilities of his time. He does not elaborate much on them, as I've shown you, but the next author that I'm going to consider does offer more details. So we now turn to Yashovijaya, again, a few more centuries on time, often regarded as the last great Jain intellectual from the early modern period. Yashovijaya's thought was very influenced by the previous Jain philosophers, especially the Haribhadras and Hemachandra. And of course, he was in a new socio-historical religious terrain. He reinterpreted many of the Haribhadra's ideas, particularly on yoga. And one of Yashovijaya's texts that includes the 4 bhavanas is this one, the Dvatrimshika. This is a text that I've been studying for a while, and as its title indicates, it includes 32 chapters, and each of the chapters includes 32 shlokas. And in this text, the bhavanas are discussed at the beginning of the chapter 11 in verses from 2 to 6. this is just the cover page of the edition that I'm using. And Yoga-Vidya gives definitions of each bhavana and differentiates 4 subtypes of each. And I have not seen this subdivision in any other text. So this really caught my attention. And then I decided to write the paper. So let's have a look at these verses. And he says, benevolence, Maitri, is considered to be a kindly mental disposition. It is to be practiced gradually towards 4 kinds of people: one's teachers, one's fellow monks, one's students, and everyone. Then he continues with compassion. Compassion is the desire to remove suffering. It arises in 4 different manners: from ignorance, from seeing the suffering of others, from the higher wish to overcome the sufferings of samsara, and from one's own nature, with regard to both who are happy and those who are not. This text also has an auto commentary where Yoga-Vidya expands on some of these ideas. In regard to the verse on compassion that I just read, he says in his auto commentary that the first type of compassion, I can leave it in the screen, that the first type of compassion arises from ignorance, which means that, for example, one might have the desire to give something that is not wholesome to someone who is unsuitable. And on his lenses, this is kind of not correct. Then the second kind of compassion, according to him, would arise, for example, from seeing someone who is suffering, such as a very poor person, and giving them food, clothes, bedding, or other worldly things. Then the third kind of compassion is a desire to liberate from the suffering of worldly life, even those who are happy and those who are dear to us. And finally, the last type of compassion arises from one's own nature, svabhava, and is directed towards all beings when one understands that everybody suffers to some extent. And then after compassion, Yoga-Vidya continues with the second one, sympathetic joy. He says, sympathetic joy brings contentment. It arises in 4 different circumstances: towards unwholesome worldly pleasures, towards that with true cause, like eating healthy food. He gives this example in the commentary. Towards wholesome beings still bound to samsara, and towards the happiness of all beings. And he continues, last one with upeksha. Well, this is the one. And about equanimity, he says, due to compassion, considering future consequences, he's referring to karma here, from non-attachment and from reflection on reality, one practices equanimity towards the unwholesome, the untimely, the pleasant, and the worthless, respectively towards everyone. In the auto commentary, Yoga-Vidya gives interesting details. For example, he mentions that although equanimity is to be kept always, as you can see here at the end, he says, respectively towards everyone. One should not remain indifferent in front of the suffering of others. Following these verses, Yoga-Vidya mentions the consequences of practicing the 4 bhavanas. And he says, from this, there is destruction of sin, strength, good conduct, and eternal knowledge. Similarly, this is indeed the nectar derived from direct experience. The rest of the chapter discusses the process and the results of meditation. Notice that Yoga-Vidya, in the verses that I show, engages with Buddhist terminology. So he uses the words Maitri, but then instead of Pramoda that we saw in the Jain text, Yoga-Vidya uses Mudita, and mudita is often used in Buddhist texts.
Alba, you're about 3 minutes over, so if you could start coming to a...
Okay, I'm finished. Then he uses karuna, and Yoga-Vidya uses upeksha instead of madhyastya, the same as the Buddhist. So in my book chapter, I also discussed briefly the 4 bhavanas in the Buddhist tradition, that they are called Brahma Vihara, the 4 immeasurables, or these different terms you have here. And also in some Brahmanical literature, such as Patanjali Yoga Sutra, and also in some of the Upanishads. But I have to limit myself here because of the constraints. So in conclusion, in the Jain text explored in this chapter, the four bhavanas serve the main purpose of eliminating karma. Compassion and equanimity have received the most attention in scholarship. Equanimity lies at the basis of all Jain meditative practices and religious life. And compassion is considered one of the four main signs of samyak darshan. Although further studies are necessary to construct a more precise genealogy of these bhavanas and to describe how they are embodied in contemporary times, this preliminary exploration demonstrates how central figures in Jain intellectual history were engaging, at least intellectually, with shared forms of religious praxis in their socio-historical context. They were trading in ethical values and corresponding techniques that were common to other religious traditions, while nevertheless retaining a commitment to their own distinct liberation. So yeah, I leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Alba Rodriguez. That was an excellent talk. I'm glad that we have a little dialogue between our two talks.